We could call this day the execution of Jesus or the martyrdom of Christ, or we could talk about his death in a kind of morbid way. But actually, the title of today's feast is the Exaltation of the Cross. We exalt an instrument used by the Romans of torture and intimidation and humiliation, and we as Christians exalt it not because of all that they did to Jesus, but because of how Jesus responded to everything that they did to him. He changes our outlook. That death is never the end. And that suffering, and pain, and death, when it's placed in the hands of Christ, he transforms all of that. And it shows us to the extent in which he will go and pour out his life and give his life for us. That's something that we should reflect on, not just today, but every day of our life. What Christ has done for us and what that means for us. Hold on to that. Last Sunday, I found myself in the middle of St. Peter's Square in Rome, Italy, 85 degrees out with my vestments on, with 85,000 people at the canonization of the new saints, Carlo, Acutis, and Pier Giorgio Frassati. And our family has had a devotion to Pier Giorgio for many years, and I credit him with keeping me in remission from my blood cancer, and so I almost felt obligated to go and convince my family, we're going to do this. So we went, and it's a beautiful celebration, despite the weather. And the actual rite of canonization it's rather short. At the very beginning of Mass, they have relics of the saints set up on the altar, and the families come up and they reverence the relics, the family of the saints. They incensed the relics. And then the Pope says a couple of prayers and declared Carlo and Pier Giorgio saints. And he spoke about them in his rather kind of brief homily. And we celebrated the rest of our Mass. It was a powerful moment to be there with my brothers and to be there amongst the church and understanding why we, in a sense, make saints. Because they should inspire us that we can be actually better than what we are. And through God's grace, good things happen. A couple of days later, I found myself again with a couple of my brothers after standing in line for an hour in a torrential downpour back at St. Peter's Square for the general audience of Pope Leo. And if you know anything about the general audience, on Wednesdays, the Pope always has this audience in St. Peter's Square, and he gets in his Pope-mobile and he drives around, and then after he's done driving around, he goes up to the altar and he gives a teaching. And several people get up and do a reading in different languages. We got there a little bit late, and the two that I was with, my brother, my younger brother, and one of his friends said, where should we stand? I said, I know the perfect place. So we stood there, had great view of where the Pope would be coming down in his Pope-mobile. But before that happened, I get a tug on my coat. This little lady, are you a priest? Yes, I am. Are you from America? Yes, I am. Will you do me a favor? Yes, I will. Will you pray for my son? I said, sure. What's the problem? What's the issue? And he said, well, he's living in California. and he's going to be going through a very complicated heart surgery in a couple of weeks. Will you pray for him and his wife and his 2 children, because the surgery will probably determine the rest of the quality of his life. He's only 32 years old. And I had this, heart surgery? Where's this heart surgery going to be done? She said, in Cleveland, Ohio, at the Cleveland Clinic. And I'm like, uh-oh. And I said, I'm from Cleveland. She goes, you're not? Yes, I am from Cleveland. This is my brother, Tom. Where are we from? We're from Cleveland. And she just looked at me and she said, wow. And I said, not only that, I'm an ongoing patient at the clinic because they are taking care of my blood cancer, and I've been in remission for 9 years, and I'm here because Pier Giorgio has inspired me, and I think he's responsible for keeping me where I'm at in my life. I'm very grateful to him. And we started sharing our faith together, and she told me the story of her family. I told her the story of my family. And then all of a sudden, after we prayed, there was this roar in the crowd, and the Pope was getting into his Pope-mobile, and I lifted up my head, and 5 seconds later, I looked, and she was gone. Lost her in the crowd. Huh? The next day, not as good of a story, but a challenging story. We go to this church in one of the neighborhoods of Rome, and in this church is one of my favorite pieces of art. It's Bernini's Transverberation of Teresa of Avila. Sounds like a strange word, transverberation. You've probably never even heard that before. But it's this beautiful sculpture that Bernini did, and it depicts Teresa of Avila's experience, the depth of her prayer, in which she describes her her sense of ecstasy in prayer, union with God, and she describes it this way: as if an angel is taking an arrow and piercing her heart. And Bernini took this and put it to a sculpture, and you've got Teresa of Avila who's leaning back, and this huge angel hanging over her, and he's about ready to throw the arrow into her heart. Beautiful picture. Beautiful sculpture. We get there to the church, and when you arrive at a church in Italy, you have to find the person who's kind of in charge. And there was this nun who was about 50 years old, and she spoke very little English. We spoke very little Italian. So you know how that goes if you've ever been in a foreign country, trying to make sense out of what she's saying. She takes us back into the sacristy where the priest will vest, and then she points to me and says, come with me. I go with her, and this is the altar area, this is where you stand, and this is where the books are at. And she takes me back into this room, and I'm away from all my brothers, and she's setting things up, and she's looking at me, and she goes, American? Yeah. American. USA? I said, yeah, USA. It's just like this concerned look on her face. And I go, something wrong? She goes, why is it that and I think this is the translation she was trying to say to me as we translate in English. Why is it that Americans lack so much love for each other? And I sat there and I was kind of stunned. She goes, shootings. She goes, Catholic school. She said, the man who got shot yesterday at that talk. And I didn't know what to say. And I'm kind of standing there watching her do her thing, and she's just kind of scurrying around. And I stopped her, and I said, Teresa. She goes, yeah, Teresa of Avila. I said, arrow to the heart. Huh? I said, me, my heart. No anger. No hatred. No resentment. No bitterness. And she's just kind of looking at me. this? I said, my heart, my goal. No anger, no bitterness, no hatred, no resentment, even if someone doesn't like me. That's the goal. And as we celebrated Mass there, and as I kind of was reflecting on Teresa of Avila and today's upcoming feast, I couldn't help but, how do we do that towards each other? How do we do that? God so loved the world that he gave us his only Son, that he who believes may not perish, but might have eternal life. You see, the feast of the exaltation of the cross is to transform us because of what Jesus did. He exalts the cross. It's one of Christians' primary symbols. Every time we see it, we should think of what Jesus did. He poured out his life. He loves to the extent of wanting us to change our hearts. And the exaltation of the cross, it means get away from all the instant gratification and look to what is forever. The exaltation of the cross tells us to strive to be better in loving one another, especially in those areas where we're lacking. If we truly believe what Jesus did for us, today's feast is for everyone. It's about the now, right now, to the forever. You see, the exaltation of the cross, it says it all.